Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Paideia Today. I am Dr. Bill Friesen, and I am joined here by my colleague, Dr. Scott Masson. And today we're going to be talking about a different text. We're going to be talking about the Odyssey and many details therein. And I'm going to begin with a reading from Book 1, the beginning of Book 1, the Invocation of the Muses, or the Muse, one in particular here. Tell me, Muse, of the man of many ways, who was driven far journeys after he sacked Troy, sacred citadel. Many were those whose cities he saw, whose minds he learned of. Many the pains he suffered in his spirit on the wide seas, struggling for his own life and homecoming of his companions. Even so, he could not save his companions, hard though he strove. They were destroyed by their own wild recklessness, the fools who devoured the oxen of Helios the sun god, and he took away the day of their homecoming. From some point here, goddess, daughter of Zeus, speak and begin our story. So one of the first things we notice here, as is typical with the epic, is an invocation of the Muses, and it has this in parallel with the Iliad. Dr. Masson, say more on these fronts here, because there are a great number of parallels, in fact, stylistic details that link the Iliad with the Odyssey.
Well, this is certainly one of them, the Invocation of the Muse. So this is telling a story that is not just a story. It seems to have a sacred element to it, and it's something beyond the capacity of a mortal poet to tell. That seems to be an aspect of it, although it's, to be fair, the Muses are invoked for a wide variety of arts, and so there's a recognition even in the telling of history or in or any number of narrative or poetic types of the need for divine help to tell the story well and suitably. But it's certainly a feature of the epic that Muse is invoked at the outset for inspiration. So that's a commonality between the Iliad and the Odyssey. We can see something else that emerges here, which is not so much the case in the Iliad, but is the case here in the Odyssey, and it's something that Horace notes to be typical of the epic. He might be commenting on the Odyssey, but he's certainly commenting on the Aeneid by his contemporary Virgil. It begins in medias res, in the middle of things. Where we're going to see that the structure of the Odyssey is such that it begins with the main figure, Odysseus, being, we don't even hear about him. So note that in the Iliad, we hear of the rage of the Achilles in the first line. In the passage you just read, we don't even hear of Odysseus, who's the main hero, until 20 odd lines down. And even then it's rather elliptically. And then there's a lot of backtracking. So it begins with background before it moves forward. So that becomes a feature of the epic thereafter, this sort of giving a bit of a background before then launching forward. And so that's one of the features. Then we have the Council of the Gods, which we saw in the Iliad as well. The gods are troubled with a problem. In the case of the Iliad, it's the problem of the treatment of Achilles and Agamemnon and the problem of the war there. In this case, it's the treatment of Agamemnon by the hand of his wife Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, who they slay him, in other words. And now we have a parallel situation where Odysseus is not yet home, but he's going to come home. And what's going to happen to him? Will what happened to Agamemnon also happen to Odysseus? Well, it could be the case, because Penelope is surrounded by suitors who are trying to win her hand and overtake the kingdom. And so the threat to Odysseus, there's a parallel being drawn there. And the gods are very alarmed about the prospect of what might happen to Odysseus on the basis of what did happen to Agamemnon. So that's there. Yeah,
the irony here, to me, it seems, is that, Agamemnon and Odysseus, along with all the others, left the comparatively or conceptually safe domestic space, and they went out to war, to conflict, and to face death, which many of them encountered, of course. And the irony, or ironia, as the Greeks might say here, is that the homecoming back to the safe place now threatens to be as deadly and dangerous as the battlefields out to which they journeyed in the first place. And this, of course, distresses the gods enormously. How do we actually recover the sanity or the sanus, the health of that domestic space, because Agamemnon's domestic space and the entire kingdom that depends upon that stability and structure has been overturned. It's been destroyed.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because when you think of war, you do think of a place of chaos, and certainly it is a place of chaos on multiple fronts. The theater of war, the moral chaos, the other forms of chaos.
Yeah.
Seems to be no good and evil. It's the fog of war is everywhere.
Yeah.
But as you've just noted, in the Odyssey, we begin with the same problem. So in their absence, these heroes, whether it's Odysseus or Agamemnon or whoever, when they leave, the disorder breaks out behind them as well. So because there's no longer a king on the throne, and so things lean towards anarchy, and that's how the Odyssey begins. His kingdom is in disarray. As
we trace through many other texts coming later in Western literature here, we're going to see them take this notion of chaos and danger slowly and quietly and insidiously invading the home space, the safe space. We're going to see it certainly when we come to Old English literature and the realm of Beowulf. We'll see it again in the literature of the High Middle Ages, particularly Arthurian literature.
Yes.
Arthur and his knights of the Round Table will go out on these dangerous quests. They will face the chaos and the darkness. Meanwhile, back at Camelot, there's trouble, and the greatest danger ends up coming from your safe base. There's
no safe space. In other words, yeah,
exactly.
Just when you thought everything was secure, and you turned your back, there it breaks out.
Disaster raises itself up, and so that's exactly what Odysseus is facing here. This is the danger, and he needs the wisest, most strategic of the gods, Athena, to help him through it. And that's a judgment on the Greeks' part. That is Athena specifically who will be the patron of the client Odysseus in facing this dangerous, ironic quest and the corruption of the home space, the hearth.
I know we're going to talk about heroism in a minute, but his heroism will have to differ from that of Achilles, where Achilles basically could face his foes straight on and just basically through sheer force of martial prowess
and
mow his enemies down. But Achilles, that's not an option for Odysseus. He needs a different means of addressing that. But let me carry on with some of the features of the epic which emerge here in the Odyssey, and in some ways I think become more normative than they are in the Iliad. The Iliad is the greatest of the two epics, or the greater of the two, and arguably the greatest of all works, and I happen to share that view. If it is first, then this is the second, because this is a great work and more influential on the subsequent ones, like the Aeneid and Homer's, or rather Milton's Paradise Lost and so forth. It has this encyclopedic quality. And it's well known that Homer was regarded as the teacher of all Hellas, by which was meant the Greek polises, the city-states, and all would look to Homer for their etiquette manual, for their ethical manual, for their model of rhetoric, for their understanding of how to do things rightly, for their understanding of hospitality, how to regard the gods, how to regard the stranger, etc., etc. And so that encyclopedic quality, so it's a wide-ranging quality, is related to this notion of paideia, and that's education in the broadest sense.
Yes. It gives you more than just hard technical details. You know, if you look at overviews of the Odyssey, you'll see some people treat the geography of the Odyssey, and others will treat the history of the Odyssey and what have you. And it has those things in it, to be sure. But it's already adopting at a much more subtle and eloquent and civilized level this notion that a true education doesn't just teach you what to think. It doesn't give you just the hard things. It gives you instead, from what we would now call a liberal arts perspective, as Roger Scruton, the modern philosopher, says, it teaches you what to think towards what object, in what way, at what time, and to what degree. How do you feel about these topics, whether it be heroism or elasticity or whatever it is? That's it. So it's teaching the emotions which guide the reasoning mind, and it disciplines those emotions, the passions, I suppose they would call them, not the emotions. And if you think of the encyclopedic nature of the Odyssey and the Iliad from that perspective, you can immediately start seeing the huge dividends it had to offer. And you can understand why the Greeks thought the way they thought, felt the way they felt, did the things that they did if you're using these two texts as kind of a roadmap to their thinking. It's invaluable in that sense.
Yeah, and so the aim isn't so Paideia then is not just passing on of information, and it's certainly not just the modern technocratic, the means of delivering it. It's really, the aim is mastery. How do you become a master of your domain, whatever that domain is? And Odysseus is to some degree the best representation of that. So he's polymertes, he's many-minded Achilles. Yes. He's the master of many ways, many arts. So he's the master of arts, if you will.
He doesn't just think certain things. He thinks about those things from many different perspectives. It's like he's got multiple personality disorder at times, but he uses it to his advantage. And this is a thing the Greeks are admiring. They're not condemning this. They're admiring this. They're trying to cultivate this. Can you see it from multiple perspectives? So I think that's a very interesting feature.
So he's what would in later narrative we would call a complex figure. He's very complicated. He's not clear or straightforward, and endlessly fascinating as such.
Yes.
The other thing he does here, which we don't see in the Iliad, but which becomes really important for epic and the epic convention and understanding of the encyclopedic nature of the epic, is that he descends to the underworld.
Yes.
And in the underworld, so in the Iliad, we've been told about the gods and their domain and what they're like, and what the theater of war is like, but we haven't really found out what that third place that the ancient world recognized, the underworld, what that is like. And Odysseus goes down to the underworld, and that's part of his heroism, of course, that he is able to not just go down there because everyone goes down there, but to rise up again. So that becomes a feature of the epic. That is one of the features that emerges here, and it will become an epic convention thereafter.
It's
and then
the realm of the dead is, as we've discussed before, it's the realm of course, enormous danger and strangeness, the uncanny and the weird, but it's also the realm of wisdom. And in many mythologies, when it comes to wisdom, and specifically wisdom of a divine, transcendent, spiritual nature, you have to converse with the dead, which oftentimes means going to them. And so the quest motif overlies this notion of the quest for wisdom, the wisdom of the dead specifically. And of course, Virgil makes great hay with this, as does Dante. And
the other feature is this is dactylic hexameter, just like the Iliad, and has the same epic similes. And so those are common features. But the descent in the underworld is new, and I think beginning in medias res is new. And the Paideia, I think that's there in the Iliad arguably as well, but this really fills it out, because that's the theater of war, and now we're moving to the theater of civilization. And so the two together give a fulsome picture of the entirety of human life.
Just to backtrack for a moment back to the notion of Paideia, you see Achilles at certain points. Achilles is a man of tremendous integrity. It's one of the core aspects of his heroism. And thus he condemns Odysseus, as we'll talk about presently here, for saying one thing and holding another in his heart.
Yeah, I think that's so important.
Yeah, it is. And this, again, it speaks to this notion of educating the character of the reader. It's not to say that these texts are didactic. I don't think they are didactic in the proper modern sense, not at all.
Not in that sense, no.
Nevertheless, they are meant to cultivate, and I use that word very deliberately and strategically, a certain aspect of character. So you might think of it like this: or the Odyssey doesn't teach you merely what to think or what to say or what to do. Those are tools in your toolbox, intellectual tools, and everybody builds those intellectual tools up as time goes by. But this educates the character that wields the tool. It's a very, very dangerous thing, as we'll see in a number of works of literature, to give a reader, a thinker, a powerful, replete toolbox without educating his or her character, which wields the tools. Because then what you've done is you've given tremendously powerful weapons.
Yeah.
Somebody whose character will take them in dark directions. So you don't want to do that. So you have to start foundationally by educating character, and then to build the tools in on top of it. Obviously, a character with no tools, intellectual tools, cultural tools, can't do much of anything. But you start with the character. And again, as we get to the Roman writers, and then when we get to Christian writers, we're going to see them really focus in on this sequence of educating within the tradition of the liberal arts. But it's already here in the Greeks, which is one of my points.
I think modern jargon, so it's not prescriptive teaching. It's more attractional. It's something.
Yes.
It's presented in a way which we want to emulate,
Yes.
or avoid if it's presented as a repugnant thing. And so we not only see or just hear it described as wicked or monstrous, we also feel a sense of repugnance.
Yes, we feel the
for
wickedness
admiration, right? And I think that really this is precisely why these texts were regarded as instructive, because true instruction isn't just spitting out answers on an exam. It's, is this going to inform your life when you're in similarly challenging situations? That's really what it comes down to. Then you have been educated. Then you really have learned.
Yes. And this is something that's going to get challenged and entirely overturned when we get to the end of the 19th century, and then especially after World War II and the Holocaust, where people talk about how highly cultured, educated people can do monstrous things, and that there's actually no connection between aesthetic value and ethical value when it comes to these texts, which I think is fundamentally wrong-headed here, because you can dismiss then 2,200 years worth of great literature on that basis. And it is.
But this is precisely what the Nazis did. I agree, and that was their intent to do it. I mean, I believe that Hitler actually regarded the idea of conscience as something that had been taught by the Jews, and which something that he wanted to get rid of. And it's really interesting that not only does he isolate it with to the Jews, and want to get rid of it because he hates the Jews, but he presents a certain educational model which I think has been picked up in areas and by people who would normally regard Hitler as an anathema. They too regard education as relatively value-free. But we'll come to talk about that as well. Let's talk about the heroism of Odysseus, because this is one of the features of the epic as well. It's not only the epic where we have heroes, but certainly we associate with the epic a certain type of hero.
Before we
Odysseus
get too far into that, can I just backtrack? There's another point here that I think we don't want to leave behind here when we're talking about these things. You mentioned right at the beginning there the invocation of the Muses, and how this embodies a notion that you are not the creative source of the work of art. We've talked about this a little bit before in previous episodes here, that rather the source of genius, for lack of a better word, and I'm using genius in the rather more Roman sense of it here. This genius is something
tutelary spirit, right?
Yes, exactly. And it's connected, of course. Genius is simply the Latin word for the daemon, which the Greeks are so obsessed with, and we'll come back, we'll talk about that too.
Yeah, Socrates had one.
Yes. But the notion here is that when they're talking about poetry, Horace talks about this, Quintilian talks about this, Aristotle talks about this. What is the content appropriate to poetry? Because nowadays we say almost as religious dogma that poetry should be able to talk about everything and anything. This is a romantic notion, but it's not just the romantics who say this nowadays. Whereas up until the Romantics, the notion was that there was certain content which was appropriate to poetry and other stuff which was not. And of course, the Enlightenment overplayed that hand, which is largely what the Romantics are lashing back against. And they won the day, and then they've held the ground. So there was no oscillation since then. What constitutes appropriate content for poetry? And the Greek response and the Roman response, indeed everybody's response in the West, was that the subject matter had to entail something of the transcendent, the otherworldly, the sacred, the spiritual, the divine. There was an elevation of tone and spirit that poetry was supposed to embody. And if you had something a little more earthy that you wanted to talk about, prose was perhaps a better choice for you. And again, with the rise of the novel, we see that taken to an extreme. The notion here is that when you invoke the Muses, you are invoking a divine source to elevate your poetry to content which is appropriate to that poetic form. This is the notion. And it can't come from the man, no matter how clever he is. Like Homer is this great artist, but he's an artist in terms of the craft, and he communicates the divine core of what is said in poetic form, but is not himself the source thereof. And this is the notion that can't be underscored, I think, quite enough to the modern reader. His job is to, as articulately and with as much craft and knowledge as possible, like any good craftsman, his job is to articulate the divine flow from the muse. In this case, probably Calliope is the one we're talking about.
Calliope, yeah.
Exactly, who's appropriate to epic poetry. And it's also important to note that of poetry, the highest form of poetry, as we've said before, is epic poetry. So nowhere is this channeling of the divine more powerful and important than in these poems. So you see immediately they're obsessed with invoking the muse at the beginning of epic poetry specifically. And later on, as we get further into other works, Milton is famous for this. He will invoke not obviously the muses, but the Holy Spirit. But I just wanted to get that, underscore that point before we moved on to the two topics of heroism.
And it's also notable that there are certain things that we would regard as lewd and crude and vulgar, and those are dealt with in the genre of comedy, but they're not dealt with in other genres. So there's a type of writing where certain things are suitable, and there's a certain type of thing that's not dealt with in those types of writing as well. So for instance, in the tragedy, the terrible deed of not the emasculation, but the blinding of Oedipus, it takes place off stage because it was regarded as something that was vulgar and which nobody ought to look upon. So it's not the pornography of violence, which we see so commonly in our literary and dramatic productions of our day. So I think that's interesting as well.
I like that notion, that the pornography of violence, because we see a celebration in modern art nowadays, not so much in poetry because no one's really writing poetry anymore, but in other art forms where the subject matter has not just accidentally or incidentally moved into the realm of the vulgar, but it actually celebrates their sheer vulgarity of it. And the more vulgar you can make your work of art, the better. It's tied in with the rise and dominance of kitsch culture, I think, in art, and anything else is seen as ludicrous. And we have seen this before. We saw this in the Enlightenment, when all of a sudden they discovered they could no longer adopt the appropriate tone to epic. This is
I note for my students that the Marquis de Sade is an Enlightenment figure.
Yes,
he really is.
You read even really good writers like Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels, all of a sudden will just indulge into this welter of scatological humor and what have you, which, in another sense, the Enlightenment period was the most proper age of them all in English cultural history. It was a great age of propriety. And so to find scatological humor and all these other things rising up amidst all this propriety and etiquette shocks a lot of readers. And it does beg the overwhelming question, why?
So let's talk about the heroism of Odysseus, because he really is a different type of man than Achilles, not in the sense they're not great leaders or great figures. They're both clearly that. And Achilles is obviously, as the Iliad established, the greatest of the Greeks. So he is the most admirable, even more so than Odysseus. Odysseus is just one man among many when it comes to the theater of conflict.
That's right.
But Achilles is the greatest. There's no doubt about that. That's interesting, and it's by the same author, Homer, or whether you want to say that it's one author or a tradition of authors. It doesn't matter. They're saying the same thing. Achilles is the model of Greek heroism. So Odysseus is not like that, and nonetheless, he's being presented in this work as a sort of a role model for us to follow. And so my question in this is Homer actually revising what heroism is? Is he presenting it as two different models of heroism, one of which is appropriate for the theater of war, one of which is more appropriate for the domestic and civil context? I'm not entirely sure, but they are quite different.
It's not just that he's a radically different kind of a hero. Like Achilles, it seems to be the judgment of the text, whether that be Homer or something else, that both models of heroism ultimately are failures. Odysseus is not a happy man by the end of this text. It's not like all of a sudden his glory has brought him peace and joy and all these sorts of things. It hasn't really. He just wants to be forgotten. Also, you're right. He's coming back to a domestic space, which maybe requires a different kind of a hero. But the heroism he deploys here is exactly the kind of behavior that Achilles, the greatest of all heroes, condemns in the Iliad.
Yes.
He is a duplicitous trickster figure who can adopt many different guises or masks, if you will, in order to win his own advantage and restore order, ironically. Go ahead.
Here's a neat way of holding on to the difference between Achilles and Odysseus. Achilles, and it's two Greek words. There's kleos, which means fame, and nostos, which is the homeward return, from which we get nostalgia in English. Algia is for pain. So nostalgia is literally a home ache, which is in German, Heimweh, but it's not in English. English, we call it homesickness. Odysseus doesn't suffer from homesickness. He suffers from not being home. So there's a pain with not being home. He aches and longs for being home. And that really is what marks Odysseus. This man wants to be back home.
Yeah.
Whereas, and his heroism is implicated in being able to return home. If he cannot return home, he will not be the famous hero that he is meant to be, in fact, fated to be. Whereas if Achilles returns home, he is not a hero.
Yes.
He must not return home. He must die on the battlefield. So if he returns home, he is not the man he's supposed to be. Whereas if Odysseus doesn't return home, he's not the man he's meant to be. So there's a sharp distinction here.
Part of me wonders whether or not Homer or whoever was not so much making assertions about heroism in sort of prescriptive senses, but rather exploring in a much more intellectual sense the types of heroism that are appropriate to various spheres, the virtues and the vices of those different species of heroism. Is the Odyssey an exploratory text, sort of in the intellectual spirit of Augustine, or is it a more prescriptive thing, say, that you might read from a Seneca or somebody like this?
Yeah,
I'm leaning towards the former model. I could be convinced to revise that opinion, but that's where I am right now.
So the two men are differing, as we just suggested, but so are their challenges.
Yes.
So Achilles gets to fight other men face up. It doesn't matter how many men. He's the greatest of all fighting men. He has no peer.
That's right.
But Odysseus, who's a great warrior himself, although not as great as Achilles, his enemies or his opponents in the Odyssey are different than Achilles. He doesn't only fight men. He has to confront witches and supernatural figures like Polyphemus, the character.
Cyclops.
The Cyclops, yes.
Cyclops.
He's one of the Cyclops. And there are cannibals. He has to fight
Scylla
and Charybdis, all sorts of supernatural figures. And he cannot fight them straight up. That's an impossibility. He will lose. In fact, he tries a few times and he loses countless men in the process. These are not fights that you can win by direct conflict. You have to find another way to solve these problems, and that is through using his mind. And so Odysseus is the representation of a heroism that is engaged with intellectual prowess, and that's how you fight the greatest of enemies, and these are the supernatural enemies.
Yeah, I think it's also important to note that he also faces antagonists, some of them more benevolent, some of them less benevolent, in the form of women.
Yes.
And so he has to deal with women, and so violence, as typically conceived, is not an option here. He has to have different ways of doing battle, if you like. And I think this is another thing that connects him very much with being a domestic hero, rather than the hero on the battlefield. So we're seeing here that there's a sort of a nexus of feminine antagonists, monstrous antagonists, domestic antagonists, domestic battlefields. There are a lot of things here that are not just different than what we encounter in the Iliad as the Iliad explores heroism, but are antithetical to those contexts that we encounter in the Iliad. And I think it's so pervasive and it's so systematic that it is part of the deliberate artistry of the Odyssey, that it takes as talking points and then adopts the opposite view on heroism and the realms of heroism that we encounter in the Iliad, which is, as you say, the greater text. So is the Odyssey in some sense a reflective text of building off of and speaking back into the Iliad? I do think so in many ways. And this is one of them: the monstrous, the feminine, the domestic.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I always teach to my undergrads. I mean, when we taught at the same institution, you used to teach the Iliad and I teach the Odyssey.
That's right.
I always felt conflicted about doing it, and you probably did the same, in part because they are really, the two together are meant to be read together or perform together or understood together, and they do really fit together, and they present a complexity together that is lacking if you only take one of the texts. What they certainly do, though, however, irrespective of whether you do the Iliad or the Odyssey, is they promote a sense of mastery by example and through adventure in a way that really interests young men. And not only young men, but young men in a way that other literary forms simply don't interest. What are your thoughts on that, Bill?
They speak to universal concerns. So it's not, these are not, I know certain professors would insist that these are both very masculine texts, that they're meant for a masculine audience, that they derive from masculine sensibilities. And yeah, you can certainly make those sorts of assertions, but because they address systematically, aggressively, and quite literally at the epic level, universal human concerns, they are not texts simply meant for the entertainment and education of men in whatever form. Having said that, I present, usually I go for the Iliad. One of the reasons I go for the Iliad is that it is such a ferociously adventurous and at times savage and violent text. It's the kind of text that young men who have been raised on a steady diet of modern literature do not expect to encounter, and they are shocked. They take several classes just to get over their shock that this is what poetry can be, and indeed more typically has been up until quite recently.
And the greatest poetry at that.
Yes, and moreover, it's not just poetry which involves adventure, the expedition, the quest, the monsters, all these sorts of things, the violence, the battling. I mean, it's the Iliad is an enormously gory text, willfully gory in places. It is also a text which is incredibly eloquent, complex, and nuanced. I mean, this is high art that requires an enormously sophisticated reader to really appreciate what's going on the page in front of him or her. And so it's the coming together of this adventurous robustness and this incredible sophistication, which they find so incredibly shocking when they first encounter the Iliad. And luckily, I had professors back during my undergraduate who said, you know, basically, we sort of associated gendering with certain approaches to poetry, which are not always helpful. And they're really unhelpful around the Aeneid, the Odyssey, the Iliad, and a host of other texts, which, as I said, require an enormously civilized, cultivated reader. But that's not necessarily a feminine trait or a masculine trait for that matter.
So, but really interesting is that Odysseus has virtues that one might associate with women. It's interesting that the goddess Athena says that you are like me, like most like me. We're two of a kind, basically. Mm-hmm. He's marked by deceit. The word is dolos. And women are marked by this feature when they do this. So when women are deceitful, it's part of their fame, their kleos. So his wife Penelope weaves this tapestry in order to deceive the suitors. Well, that's part of her fame.
We're meant to applaud that deception.
Absolutely. And this is something that's entirely appropriate. It's not normally seen as appropriate for a man to do this, but it is precisely what Odysseus does, and he's applauded for it. And moreover, it's presented as prescriptive in certain contexts. To some degree, Odysseus models that. And in fact, those instances where he acts a bit like Achilles, such as in the infamous instance when he blinds Polyphemus and then reveals who he is. You know, you ask for my name is Odysseus, son of Laertes, sacker of cities, etc. You remember that name. And then, of course, then he cries out to Poseidon, his father, and that is the moment of Odysseus's great downfall, is when he acts like a man.
Well, yeah, he got the fame he desired. But I'm quoting a later Viking hero. Everybody earns fame in their own way, and sometimes that fame is in the form of infamy. Or in this case here, it's not so much infamy as the undoing of the man. Had he kept his identity to himself, he would have been spared much suffering and sorrow and hardship. The time and again we see in the Odyssey, one of the heroic traits which most identifies Odysseus is the fact that he does keep his mouth shut. He doesn't say what he wants to say. He does not reveal who he is. He moves incognito in numerous places, whether it's Ithaca. He is very, very prudent. The man's self-restraint is one of his most remarkable features. And this is something that is difficult for some modern readers to get their brain around, that heroism would involve a restraint, of a reining in of your identity, your glory, your name, your virtues. With Achilles, when he finally goes into actions, it's all on display.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas Odysseus, it is ruthlessly, carefully, systematically covered up.
That's exactly what Athena counsels him. You will have to, and he returns in the guise of a beggar even,
yes.
and he's told that he must do this in order to recognize who his friends and his foes are, and really in order to survive, because if he arrives on the island and so shall we leave it off there with that account of heroism, and maybe we'll pick it up next episode and we can talk about the portrait of Telemachus, this immature young man, and we can talk about where we go from there.
Yeah, because that'll tie in nicely to notions of Paideia and growth and education and maturation and whatnot. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for listening.